go.
Good morning. I'm very glad you could join me. Now, this is U.S. History, and this is Lecture 2. I just wanted to say that I wish all of you and yours well. But we're going to get started, and you should have the list of terms for Chapter 28, and this will help you in following with the lecture. Now, my plan here is you watch about 20 minutes at most, and then take a break. I'm recording, this will be an hour recording, and so I'm anticipating 3 breaks, and I'll be recording others. Now, to get us started, Chapter 28 is mainly dealing with social history within the United States. This is a period of 1960 to about 1974. Now, you may wonder why we're not talking about foreign policy. The next chapter, Chapter 29, is dealing primarily with foreign policy events, things like the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Vietnam War, and all that sort of thing. And it will be going through the several presidential administrations, from Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, and perhaps even into Carter. But today we're looking at Chapter 28, which was entitled Reform, Rebellion, and Reaction. A lot of the social movements that we talk about will be inspired by for different reasons. For example, the chapter starts out talking about Fannie Lou Hamer. Fannie Lou Hamer is one of the today largely or almost forgotten heroes of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. But hers is an important story because she is one of those average people, one of those average African Americans who decided that the system was wrong and she should do something to try and correct it. And as I had said before, in the 1950s, the civil rights movement was mainly started because of average Americans, people from all walks of life who decided that this system is wrong. You know, black Americans and white Americans are both equal Americans and entitled to all of the privileges and rights thereof. And those movements were largely led by average people, or ordinary people, like I say, from all walks of life. But today we're going to start with the 1960 presidential election. President Eisenhower, of course, was retiring. He had served 2 terms. His vice president, Richard Nixon, would be the Republican candidate. The Democratic candidate, after some struggle with other Democrats who wanted to run for the presidency, among them Lyndon B. Johnson from Texas, the Democratic candidate in 1960 would end up being John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Now, John F. Kennedy came from a privileged background. He was the son of an Irish-American Catholic businessman. Joseph Kennedy. Joseph Kennedy had served as the American ambassador to Great Britain. And Joseph Kennedy nourished political ambitions for his sons. In fact, many scholars say that he was grooming his oldest son, Joseph Kennedy Jr., for politics and maybe to run for the presidency. His oldest son, Joe Jr., was serving in the American military, the U.S. Army Air Corps, where he died in a bombing mission. John F. Kennedy was serving in the Navy, where he was the commander of a PT, a patrol torpedo boat, PT boat, basically a small, fast boat built out of plywood. Now, after the war, like many politicians, for example, we saw Richard Nixon after the war. Nixon did serve in the war as well. Nixon became involved in politics. Joseph McCarthy, who we've already talked about, or you've read about, Joseph McCarthy served in the Army and invented a war record for himself. He didn't serve in combat, but he still served, which is honorable. But he wanted to go into politics, and he thought that a war record would look even better. So that's where we got the image of Tail Gunner Joe. It would also be television that helped to bring down Senator Joseph McCarthy, if you recall that section from the previous chapter. Now, in 1960, Vice President Nixon tried to campaign in all 50 states. This would be the first election in which there were 50 states, by the way. The last two states had joined the Union in 1959. Kennedy, John F. Kennedy focused on certain crucial states. He also, with the help of his World War II Navy record, he had served in combat and was decorated. His father had lots of money to support his campaign. And in the eyes of some people in 1960, Kennedy looked handsome, dynamic. Now, Kennedy would also be the youngest person elected to the presidency. He would be 43 years old. This would also be the very first presidential election in which the candidates agreed to the first televised debates. And this is again showing the increasing importance of television in politics. Now, both candidates were eager to debate. Richard Nixon had been a champion college debate person. He had done very well at debate, so he was eager to debate Kennedy. But their preparation was a little different. They had 4 debates, and if you get a chance, you can actually look on your devices and see an excerpt or so from these televised debates. They were in black and white, which most Americans had black and white televisions at that time. And you can see what the candidates look like and how they reacted. Now, it is a good debate tactic when you're making a verbal point to focus on your opponent. Lock eyes with them, some people say. And Vice President Nixon did just that. He focused on his opponent when he was making a verbal attack. Senator Kennedy, by the way, I did not mention, John F. Kennedy was senator from Massachusetts. Senator Kennedy did not look at Nixon when he was responding or making a verbal point. He looked directly into the television camera. Americans who were watching on television felt that Kennedy was communicating directly with them. It is interesting that Americans who watched the debates on television thought that Kennedy did better. But Americans who listened to the debates on radio thought that Vice President Nixon did better. Interesting comparison. Now, in 1960, John F. Kennedy defeated his Republican opponent, Richard Nixon. It was a painfully close election. We're talking about Kennedy won by just over 112,000 votes, popular votes. The margin of the vote was 0.17%. Now, Kennedy won an easier victory in the Electoral College, which I presume everyone is still familiar with. But that very close election, Kennedy felt that he did not have the support of many Americans, or as he didn't have the support of a majority of Americans, so he would actually be very cautious in his approach to politics. His close election would make him more cautious in his approach to domestic policy, to everything. He wanted to build up support. He wanted to increase popularity for his administration, thinking about, of course, 1964 running for re-election. Now, Kennedy's inaugural address is when he said, that Americans were going to be going into space in a new way. It would be President Kennedy who said that Americans would be landing, that an American would land on the moon and would be brought back safely to the Earth by the end of the decade. The people at NASA were freaked out by this because they knew that at that point, January 1961, they couldn't do it. But Kennedy's administration projected energy, idealism. Some people would say that the idealism of the Kennedy administration would inspire other Americans, and this relates to the social history in this chapter, would inspire other Americans to want to change America, to make it more equal, more fair, etc. And at the same time, while Americans were striving to change American society, there would be some Americans who would be alienated by all of the change, by all of the events happening in the 1960s. And of course, that could help start a backlash, a reaction. Now, Kennedy preferred foreign policy, but in the domestic arena, he would be cautious, as I said before, he would be pragmatic. At his inauguration, Kennedy declared that a new generation was assuming leadership. And he called on Americans to not be complacent, to not be self-indulgent, to do things to serve the common good. The famous quote, "Let not." I presume everyone knows the rest. What your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Now, that quote was not completely original with Kennedy, but Americans picked up on that ideal. And, as I said, his idealism inspired many people. Kennedy wanted to project a different image from the previous administration. Now, President Eisenhower, of course, was a much older man. He had a distinguished military career. To relax, President Eisenhower liked to play golf. President Kennedy would call a break in a cabinet meeting, and he and some other cabinet members would go out on the lawn of the White House and would play touch football. This presents a different image, and frankly, tourists loved it. Now, Kennedy had promised to expand the welfare state. He proposed doing a lot more than what he actually did. Because as we all know, he would only be president from January of 1961 until November 1963. But when Kennedy was campaigning in Appalachia and places like Eastern Tennessee, Eastern Kentucky, Western Virginia, he was moved by the desperate poverty that he saw there. And Kennedy helped to push poverty as a concept onto the national agenda. Now, Kennedy did get support for a $2 billion urban renewal program, legislation that offered incentives to businesses to locate in depressed areas. They also established a job training program for the unemployed. And Kennedy promised to make economic growth a key objective. In his words, and John F. Kennedy was a sailor. He sometimes liked taking his family sailing on a sailboat. And in his own words, a rising tide floats all boats. So he called for a huge tax cut to stimulate the economy. Kennedy also, of course, called for this anti-poverty program. He called for support of the civil rights movement, although, to be fair, Kennedy was sometimes slow to support the civil rights movement, and there would be conditions or events within the civil rights movement that would be going beyond what the administration would prefer. And there were times that Kennedy would be forced to act, and ultimately would, to support the civil rights movement. Kennedy also was the president who proposed federal aid to education. He also proposed a national health care system. Now, his efforts were basically, he was running into obstacles. He was running into opposition in Congress. Democrats controlled the Congress, but a major part of the Democrats in Congress were Southern white Democrats who were not as supportive of, say, Kennedy's civil rights idea or ideals as what many people thought that they could have been. So, Kennedy was preparing for his re-election in 1964 when he made a trip to Dallas, Texas on November 22nd, 1963, where he would fall victim to an assassin's bullet. Kennedy's vice president was Lyndon B. Johnson. Johnson had been added to the Kennedy ticket to appeal to Southern voters. Remember, Johnson was from Texas. And Johnson was very ambitious. And Johnson had put his own presidential aspirations on hold in 1960, agreeing to become the vice presidential candidate. Now, Johnson was sworn into office on Air Force One with President Kennedy's body on the plane. President Johnson appointed a commission headed by Supreme Court Chief Justice Earl Warren, and what was called the Warren Commission concluded about the Kennedy assassination in 1964. The Warren Commission concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald was acting alone, that he was not a Soviet agent, and that Lee Harvey Oswald assassinated President Kennedy. Also wounded in the assassination was Texas Governor John Connally. Now, the Warren Commission also said that Jack Ruby was a Dallas nightclub owner, and according to some scholars had connections to both the CIA and the Mafia. Jack Ruby killed Oswald 2 days after the assassination on the 24th of November, when Dallas police were moving Oswald from one jail facility to another. Jack Ruby came out of nowhere, shot Oswald in the abdominal area. Oswald curled up into the fetal position, fell down. Ruby was captured on the scene. By the way, this shooting of Oswald was carried live on the 3 television networks that were available for most Americans in 1963. On a personal note, in 1963, when President Kennedy was assassinated, all of the public schools shut down in the country. So I, along with my younger sister and brother, were at home, and of course, being out of school, I was watching television, and the only thing on television was programming related to the assassination. So I didn't really understand it at first, but I saw Jack Ruby come out of a crowd. I did not know who he was, and I just saw a man's back go up, basically walk up real fast. And later it was revealed he said, "You shot my president," or "You killed my president," and he shot Oswald. Now, that was carried live, so millions of Americans saw this. This is when the television networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, decided to install it's 4 to 7 second delay, so something could be blipped out before it was sent out over the television airways. Now, the Warren Commission also concluded that Jack Ruby acted alone. Now, Jack Ruby would die a couple of years later. I think the report was cancer in prison. Some scholars have continued to debate over Kennedy's domestic record. His first 2 years were not that remarkable, but other scholars have suggested that in 1963, he had made an important shift. In 1963, with his proposal on taxes, the tax cut that I mentioned earlier, suggesting that Americans should be supporting a war on poverty. And there had been a study that had come out in the 1960s, a book entitled The Other America. You do not have to look this book up, but this book basically showed that around 20%, 1/5 of all Americans lived below the poverty level. And this was in the wealthiest country in the world. And some people thought that was rather abysmal at best. Kennedy had also, I mentioned earlier, called for federal aid to education. And he came around to support civil rights. Kennedy's health insurance proposal ran into opposition from the medical community, so he would let that drop. Kennedy proposed that the federal government should give some money to public schools to help them provide educational facilities, materials, etc. to students. But Kennedy's federal aid to education came under criticism. Some people said, well, what about private schools, parochial schools? Kennedy was a product of private schools. And they said, well, if we want to help American students, should we do something to help students in private schools, in private or parochial schools? And some people were critical of this, and Kennedy did not want to look like he was favoring private schools or Catholic schools, so he would drop that issue too. On civil rights, Kennedy, as I said before, was forced by events to take a stronger position on civil rights. As we shall look at, in 1960, just to remind you, the civil rights movement had taken a dramatic step with the sit-in movement in Greensboro, North Carolina, or the beginning of the sit-in movement. Students, ordinary college students, using nonviolent civil disobedience, going to a restaurant or some facility and asking to be served. And of course they were denied service and they would be arrested. But this was the beginning of the movement. In 1961, we'll look at a little more detail on these two. In 1961, there was the Freedom Rides, The Freedom Rides, which were black and white demonstrators, volunteered to purchase bus tickets to ride from Washington, D.C. to final destination, New Orleans, Louisiana. And en route, in many bus stations in the South, they had segregated waiting rooms. Some that said white only, some that said colored only or colored waiting room, using those terms at the time. And so these demonstrators would all, black and white, would all go into one waiting room to, again, using nonviolent civil disobedience. And of course, violence, they were met with violence in several places, as we shall see. In June of 1963, NAACP leader and civil rights worker Medgar Evers. Medgar Evers is about in the middle of your left-hand column. He's right under Earl Warren. Medgar Evers was gunned down, murdered in front of his home in Jackson, Mississippi. And of course, as would be later determined, the man accused of the murder of Medgar Evers, Byron De La Beckwith, would not be. He was found not guilty by a Mississippi jury of all white males. He was tried twice, found not guilty. He was not found guilty until the 1990s, I believe it was, when he was living in Signal Mountain, Tennessee, and he did go to prison for the rest of his life. Also in 1963, in August, was the famous March on Washington. Martin Luther King Jr. and other leaders. There were your textbook estimates 250,000 people. Other sources say 350,000 people. The exact number is not that important, but it was a large and peaceful gathering of blacks and whites in the nation's capital to hear many speeches. King was only one of many speakers, and this is where he made his famous "I Had a Dream" speech. Now, the March on Washington had been organized to support the Civil Rights Bill that John F. Kennedy had proposed prior to that. So the March on Washington was in support of the Civil Rights Bill. Kennedy had proposed a Civil Rights Bill to ban discrimination in public accommodations. Perhaps more simply put, if you had a business that was open to the public, you would have to be open to all of the public. Or say in hiring practices or education. So Kennedy had proposed the Civil Rights Bill, which was honestly, it was languishing in Congress. It was not making much momentum. And the March on Washington was to support that. Now, Kennedy, of course, is assassinated. I know there have been lingering questions about the Kennedy assassination since, leading to all sorts of conspiracy theories, and as I have said in my classes, Americans seem to love conspiracy theories. But I'm not so concerned about that as I am with the results, or the results of the Johnson administration. Lyndon B. Johnson becomes president with a wide background of political experience. He was ambitious. To some, his coarse wit or coarse humor and his vanity alienated some people who preferred the more sophisticated Kennedy style. And throughout his life, Johnson would be a bit resentful of the Kennedys, of the Harvard establishment, that sort of thing. But Kennedy, where Kennedy was not great at getting a lot of things done with Congress, Johnson excelled in working with Congress. From having been in Congress, in the House and the Senate, for many years, he understood how Congress worked. And he also excelled at working behind the scenes. There's a famous photograph, it is reproduced in your textbook, of Johnson talking closely with another political leader and literally just kind of leaning over him, physically dominating the scene. But Johnson would make promises too, and would support other politicians' programs. He said, okay, if you'll support this for me, I'll support something for you. And Johnson would do this, where he would either entice or he might even threaten legislators to support his objectives. Now, Johnson's goal as president, he wanted to fulfill Kennedy's agenda. And he also wanted to be elected in his own right as president in 1964. Off camera or unofficially, Johnson wanted to have the nickname Landslide Lyndon. And in a very good study of Lyndon Johnson, Doris Kearns Goodwin said that Johnson was basically motivated by two impulses: his mother and his father, not uncommon with most people. His mother, who was more intellectual, artistic, supported some of the finer things in life. His father was some people would say a crude Texas state politician who would cater to his district in eastern Texas. And that Johnson had this dichotomy, this background, that trying to please both parents unconsciously, that to get approval. Johnson really wanted to make the United States, to make America a more fair, a more equal society. And it is, of course, very ironic that ultimately what would happen, his involvement in foreign affairs, specifically the Vietnam War, would limit and some people would say destroy his objectives. Where President Kennedy's agenda had been known as the New Frontier, and of course some people referred the New Frontier as to space, Johnson's program, especially his domestic program, would be referred to as the Great Society. The Great Society. New Frontier and Great Society, I wrote in New Frontier on your list of terms, and I put the initials of the presidents. It was very popular in the 1960s, and it's kind of a nod to Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR. Kennedy would be known as JFK. Johnson would be known as LBJ. In fact, one of Johnson's campaign slogans would be "All the Way with LBJ." Now, as I said before, Johnson understood how to work with Congress. Johnson would get Kennedy's proposed tax cut through Congress. And it would actually start one of the largest economic booms in American history. It's interesting to look at. Because in the 1950s, most Americans today do not realize that in the 1950s, the middle class had been shouldering, earlier in American history in the 1920s, the middle class had been shouldering a good bit of the tax burden. In the 1950s, millionaires had a 90 or 95% tax rate. Now, we had a 90 and 95% tax rate, and we still had millionaires. But this tax cut stimulates an economic boom that Johnson gets through. Johnson also, he laid a guilt trip on Congress. He did. Johnson, just days after the funeral for President Kennedy, and with Kennedy's death, many Americans today do not realize, but there was almost a frenzy of naming things in honor of the slain president. And there was the famous comparison between President Lincoln and President Kennedy. It's sort of interesting to look at, but that's as far as it goes. Yes, Lincoln had a secretary named Kennedy. Kennedy had a secretary named Lincoln. You know, but I wouldn't be distracted by that. Just days after Kennedy's funeral, Johnson asked Congress, what better tribute can you make to our slain president than to pass the civil rights bill that he asked you to pass months before? Johnson got the Civil Rights Act of 1964 through Congress. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 would be the strongest civil rights action since Reconstruction. And basically, in almost 100 years, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 would be the strongest measure since Reconstruction. What does the Civil Rights Act of 1964 do? The Civil Rights Act of 1964 made discrimination illegal in employment. So if you were hiring for a job, you had to consider all applicants. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 made discrimination in education illegal, basically supporting the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision. The 1964 Civil Rights Act also made discrimination in public accommodations illegal. So if you had a hotel or if you had a restaurant, you could no longer have the sign that says white only. If you were open to the public, you had to be open to all of the public. Now, this would also put pressure on public school areas, more so, especially in the southern states, to desegregate schools. And I know the South is often used as, or described in a less than favorable light, but by 1972, the South had more integrated classrooms. The American South had more integrated classrooms by 1972 than the rest of the United States. So there was progress. Now, that progress did not last. If we look at today's society, or as we shall see in the 1980s and 90s, that did not last, and there has been almost like a resegregation, not legally, but a de facto resegregation of schools today. But we should look at more at this. The Civil Rights Act, if you're open to the public, you have to be open to all of the public. Now, I often refer students that you sometimes see in businesses, and it wasn't, I know, a few years ago there was even a sign in the BBC facing the door where you enter. There was a small sign, "We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone." Constitutionally, that's illegal. There is no such right. You cannot reserve a right to refuse service to anyone. Now, you can have reasons to exclude people. You can be open to the public and have a dress code. A dress code is impartial. If you have to, you can require a tie and a jacket to receive service. You can require that patrons wear shoes. That is constitutional. There's no problem with that. But you can't simply say that I will decide as the proprietor of an establishment who, or I will serve or not serve. That is unconstitutional. But you still see it occasionally. But I thought I'd call your attention to that in case you do see that. Quickly after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed, came a response to Johnson also picked up what he called an unconditional war on poverty. The result of this would be the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964. The Economic Opportunity Act of 1964, without going into a lot of detail, and by the way, I inadvertently marked out the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964. It's on your list. I marked it out. That term is still good. The Economic Opportunity Act of 1964 authorized 10 programs under the newly created Office of Economic Opportunity. And for the first year of its operation, this Office of Economic Opportunity was given $800 million for their budget. Now, the most novel and yet the most controversial part of the law was the Community Action Program. The Community Action Program, some people would call it CAP, C-A-P, Community Action Program, required what the law said, quote, maximum feasible participation from poor people themselves in anti-poverty programs. And it actually, these community action programs stimulated organizing by poor people in poverty-stricken areas to take control of their own neighborhoods. And yet, sometimes when people would step up to take control, they ran into opposition from government bureaucrats who thought that, well, no, we should be running things, without that much input from citizens. So you have some clash of ideals in this area. Now, Lyndon Johnson projected stability. He projected security in the middle of a booming economy in 1964. Now, on a note of social history, some people have said and written that the United States was in a depression, was in a major depression after the assassination of President Kennedy. And Americans were affected by this. That is true. And some people said that in February of 1964, when the rock group from Liverpool, England, a group called the Beatles, first appeared on American television on the Ed Sullivan Show, that they started a revolution of sorts too. People in social history and in rock and roll would refer to the British invasion, that the Beatles would become, and still, if not the world's #1 group, one of the world's most popular and well-known musical groups that would have a major input on society. But some people have said that when the Beatles came along with their upbeat attitude, their positive, their positive messages, although some of their songs dealt with some feelings of teen alienation of young people. They tended to be upbeat, optimistic, fun-loving, and it brought a change. Some people said that it helped bring Americans out of this slump after the death of Kennedy. Now, I think it's interesting to consider, but there are many other factors too. There was the major economic boom happening in 1964. 1964, the economy is booming and Johnson wants to run for re-election. Now, Johnson's Republican opponent was Arizona Senator Barry M. Goldwater. Barry Goldwater received a good bit of grassroots support for his campaign, and there was the beginnings of a movement on the right that would start growing alongside what was then the more visible left wing or liberal movements, or movements on the left. There would be a movement on the right that would start growing. In 1964, Johnson was able, the Democratic Party was able to use television again in a very effective campaign message that basically made Goldwater look more militant, that he was going to use nukes with no good reason, perhaps. And it was a famous cartoon of a young girl pulling petals off of, not a cartoon, but a film, a commercial of a young girl pulling petals off of a flower, while in the background there was a countdown going on, 10, 9, 8, etc., countdown for a missile launch. Very effective. In 1964, Ronald Reagan, who had been a New Deal Democrat, Ronald Reagan was alarmed by some of the liberal movements within the Democratic Party, and Ronald Reagan was the leader of a very small group in 1964, a group called Democrats for Goldwater. Now, Johnson, as I said earlier, wanted the nickname of Landslide Lyndon. And in 1964, Johnson would get his landslide. Johnson got 62% of the popular vote. Johnson got 62% of the popular vote in 1964. No president has achieved that since. Now, Nixon came close to that in 1972. But no one has made that 62% of the popular vote that Johnson got in 1964, and yet, as we shall see, Johnson's popularity would dwindle in 4 years from that 62%. Barry Goldwater carried Arizona and a few deep south southern states. To my recollection, yes, that was only a few states went for Goldwater. And it was a major election victory. Johnson, with Democrats controlling the Congress, Johnson will want to usher in his great society. And Johnson would be very successful in doing so if you look at the sheer volume, the sheer amount of laws, new laws passed in his administration. Now, Lecture 3 will be dealing with more aspects of Johnson, and we will be looking at some of these movements in society. I hope you have taken breaks today. This has been almost an hour. Right around 55 minutes, and I have enjoyed being here recording this for you. I want to wish you all the best, and this video should be available in a couple of days. Today is Tuesday, March 31st, and I will be talking to you at some time in the near future. Goodbye for now, and thank you.